Hello, friends. Welcome to another session of the video logs that the Center for Global Studies Kolkata is coming up with. And this is the next one in the series of the Afghan crisis and global responses. We have with us today Ms. Bilquees Daud, who is the lecturer in the Jindal School of International Affairs at the Jindal Global University. Ms. Daud is herself a national of Afghanistan. She had to leave Afghanistan during the civil war. She left Afghanistan in 1993 and then went back in 2003. Now, of course, she is here in India, and I hope you're enjoying yourself, Ms. Daud. Welcome to the Center for Global Studies.
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving me a chance to speak.
The kind of questions that are doing the rounds in Afghanistan, there are plenty of experts in Afghanistan, but very few people who have the kind of first-hand experience that you do. So we thought it's only fitting that a person like you should be given a platform to speak about these things. So I have a few questions dealing essentially with an aspect of the Afghan issue that has been sort of been boiling on the pot from the early 2000s, is to the treatment of women in Afghanistan by the Taliban regime that was toppled. And now that the Taliban are back at the helm, the way they might be treated. The first question I had for you was that Afghanistan, as you would know, has been a very traditional society for the better part of the 20th century, in which women did not seem to have had much presence in public life, as they do, for instance, in Western societies or in many other parts of the world. Now, was the Taliban rule much different for women, even in terms of such a traditional society? Meaning, having been in Afghanistan before the Taliban was there, and then seeing the kind of things they did, how different were the Taliban from, meaning the first Taliban rule, from what it previously used to be like? If you could shed some light on it.
Thank you. A very important question. Yeah, the issue of women's rights and women's participation in different spheres of life in Afghanistan have always been very politicized. You know, though through much of the Afghanistan history, women have always been the carriers of certain traditional practices that were rooted in a very strong patriarchal society in Afghanistan, right? For example, the sense of namus, honor, associated always with women and families and communities and country that had to be protected, right, through a main member of the society. But actually, when we are talking about women's rights and the era of Taliban brings very dark memories because, like, I mean, now this era of Taliban brings a very dark memory of the era of 1996. Because the overall understanding of Afghan women's rights and much of the world is that the rights that were given to Afghan women, it's only because of 2001 interventions. But actually, I would like to challenge this because the rights that we have today, it's not entirely the gift of the West. Actually, Afghan women throughout the history in different periods of time, they have gained different rights that were very important. For example, even in the most controversial, regimes, like, for example, in the time of Amir Abdul Rahman Khan, if I go back to the history in 1880 till 1901, even that ruler, he actually gave certain rights for women. For example, he abolished the practice of widows to be forced into marriage. Okay, he also increased the legal age of marriage from 14 to 16, and he also kind of introduced many other reforms. But after that, of course, the era of King Amanullah Khan in 1919 till 1929, which was the golden era for women. King Amanullah Khan, who also gave us independence, he provided lots of certain, reforms for women. He was by himself, he was a very liberal man. He believed in the modernization of Afghanistan society. So, for the first time in his era, education for girls, opening new schools for girls, and he opened a variety of institutions for women. For the first time, he also allowed Afghan women to go abroad on scholarship and study. And he also, because he was very inspired by the Turkish model. His father-in-law, Mahmoud Terzi, was his advisor, and Mahmoud Terzi spent lots of time in Turkey, and he was inspired by Ataturk's reform in Turkey. So, and also Queen of Afghanistan at that time, Queen Suraya, by herself, she was symbol of a woman's liberation, because she would accompany the king in every, visit abroad, and she was not veiling, she was not covering her head. And also for the first time, she also came up with a journal that was, named by Irshad Niswan. It means guidance for women, which actually advocated gender equality. So, so that era, and then of course, the reforms that were provided by the King Amanullah Khan, those reforms were too harsh or too sudden for a society, for a traditional society like Afghanistan. So it was also backlash by a rural population. But then, in the time of King Zahir Shah, who ruled Afghanistan for 40 years, actually, he came up with a more gradual reforms. And even in the Constitution of 1964, under King Zahir Shah, he provided women for the first time the right to vote. And so by this, it shows that Afghan women got the right to vote much before than many of the neighboring countries. So, and of course, then the Daud Khan periods also, and then the communist era, though it was, it's a very critical era, and the overall reform were only in the urban centers. But still, that era is also considered a golden era for women, because majority of women were working outside the home. Like Ministry of Education on that time, 70% of the civil servants in the Ministry of Education were women. 70% of school teachers were women. So, so it says a lot. Then actually, the undermining women's right in Afghanistan started with the era of Mujahideen and civil war from 1992 till 1996. Of course, Taliban took it to another level, and we all know what they did.
Yeah. So it's almost like it's not simply Kamal Ataturk and his vision of what Turkey should be like, but also the Iranian society, the reforms that the Pahlavis had introduced. It was almost that Afghanistan was on the same page till it was almost yanked back by the period of the civil war and the social churning. Would you say this is the urban-rural factor that is coming to play? So people who are coming from more rural background, bringing their traditional social mores and imposing it in the name of Islam? Is that how you would look at this kind of imposition on women?
Well, yeah, that is true. Rural-urban divide have always been in Afghanistan, but especially in the era of Mujahideen civil war, if we see a majority of the Mujahideen leaders, they actually came from rural areas.
Right.
Those some of them were highly educated, like Ahmad Shah Massoud and Gulbuddin Ekmatyar. They were highly educated. They studied together in the Polytechnic University in Kabul. So they were kind of familiar with the urban settings, but still the urban and rural divide was there, and that could be one cause. But also in Afghanistan, another aspect is that we always had very weak central government. The central government never had like presence in the it never had strong presence in the rural areas. So that's why the reforms, the liberation of women, emancipation, there was mostly concentrated on the urban centers and the capital. However, I must also mention that before the era of Islamization, before the era of radicalization, women in rural areas of Afghanistan, they were more, they had, I wouldn't say more liberal, but they had more say, and they had more kind of freedom of movement than many women in urban centers, for a variety of reasons. Because in rural areas, people usually live in communities, right? And very small communities.
Yeah.
So, for example, the concept of chadari, this blue burqa, right?
Yeah.
That is not a rural concept. That's an urban concept. For example, a woman in Paktika, in my village, in Sarawza village in Paktika, they never wear chadari. They were wearing a black chadar because they were living in close communities, and usually they feel very safe. They feel protected, so they don't feel to cover themselves, because they, in one village, everyone knows each other, and so there is no insecurity in that sense. But people who migrated from rural areas and came to urban centers, because urban centers were more, they got connected with people that were not from their communities, then that is how women started wearing the blue chadari, to be more protected and to be not so visible. So because there were certain sense of insecurities when we are coming to a new place, right? So before the old era of Mujahideen, the old era of Islamization, women in rural areas, they had very different lifestyles. So the concept that, South and Southeastern region, for example, have always been that conservative, that is not really true.
This is very interesting. So it's more like a suburban and urban tension rather than an urban-rural tension. Okay,
Yes.
that's fascinating. So to come to the second question, which probably would have then, I'm able to anticipate some parts of it, but let's hear it from you yourself. How had the lives of Afghan women changed in the last 20 years of US presence and US-backed government that you had in Afghanistan? Would you say that the change was limited only to a few urban pockets, as many Western thinkers are now beginning to say, that the intervention was more confined to pockets and never really penetrated into the countryside? And is that true? If it's so, is it true also for the condition of women? So that the real difference, would it be only in urban pockets, or would it be felt all across Afghanistan?
Well, that is one factor, and that is true to some extent. The 2001 intervention actually expanded the women's right in Afghanistan. We have already had certain rights, but they have expanded it. They helped us to grow more. And undeniably, we had lots of progress made in last 20 years. Like, that's a fact, especially in the sectors of in health and education sector. The maternal mortality rate and infant mortality rate has really gone down. And of course, access to education. In education, we have lots of success stories. Enrollment in school have really gone up. Majority of women are giving a chance to go abroad and to gain scholarships, and also political participation of women. If you see the kind of numbers of women politicians represented in different different houses of parliament, it is much higher than many neighboring countries. So political participation is also a success story of the last 20 years. But of course, there were also challenges. One challenge is that the mostly donor agencies and aid were concentrated in the urban centers, right? Not really to the rural areas. But, at the first years of intervention, like from 2002 till 2007, actually even the rural areas benefited from some of the aid money and from some of the NGO activities, because the security was really good. Like, you could just take a car and go from Kabul to Paktika, for example. But then after 2007, the security really deteriorated. But of course, women's rights, I must say that the biggest challenge was that the kind of women's right that was preached, that was not really according to the value of traditional society like Afghanistan. So that's why, again, there was a clash of, cultures. Like people in rural areas, they didn't really fit to the kind of module of women right that West was kind of, trying
that was
to bring to
acceptable.
Afghanistan. Yes.
Yeah.
And because I worked for many years in the NGO sector, so I know that the project would have come and the project would have been pre-designed. So that was a mistake. The project should have been according to the ground realities. So that pre-designed projects did not work in Afghanistan. It worked for short time, but as you see, nothing was sustainable. So everything collapsed in a matter of few days or few hours, right? So nothing sustainable has been done beside the political participation and education and health sector.
Yeah, that's very true what you say. So the final question that I would have probably is the experience of women during the first Taliban administration was not particularly pleasant. How different do you see the present dispensation is going to be? I ask you this the very simple reason, because as I say, it's a wrong analogy. Please don't mind. This is not meant to be a sexist kind of thing. But it says you can't put the genie back into the bottle once the genie is out. Once people have tasted freedom, how do you repress them the way the Taliban tried to the first time round? Do you think there would be lessons learned on part of the Taliban, or do you think it's going to be kind of ideological blindsiding and that they would try to renew what they had started earlier?
Well, the first thing is that Taliban are dealing with a different Afghanistan now, right?
That's right.
Afghanistan is not the same as 20 years back.
Right.
So 1996, when Taliban took over, Afghanistan was very different. Afghanistan suffered from 4 years of war, right? And, so everything was collapsed. There was no infrastructure, because the era of Mujahideen have always been forgotten in the history and even among scholars, abroad. They usually talk about Taliban, but not the era of Mujahideen. So what we see is actually started during the Mujahideen period, right? And during the Mujahideen period, women were not allowed to go to school, not because they banned them, but because it was the insecurity was women feel insecure, because on that time forced marriages, rape, abduction were very common. So that's why families did not want their girls to go to school. And also the kind of public beating that we are seeing, it actually started with the Mujahideen era, and the Sharia law started with the Mujahideen era, right? But so when Taliban took over on that time, Afghanistan was totally different. And yet, as you see now, also in 1996, we don't see any single protest against Taliban. But now it's very different. Afghan women are not the same. Afghanistan is not the same. Afghan men and women, they are not the same, right?
That's right.
They have got more exposure. They were connected to the world much than before, right? To different platforms. So as you see that, I don't think the Taliban have changed, but I think the Afghan people have changed. Taliban might have changed, but they have changed for worse, because
Right.
now they know how to do PR. Now they are more clever. They want international recognition. So that's why they are just showing to the
Mm,
world that they have changed. Actually,
mm,
it's the people of Afghanistan who have changed. As you see, that the first protest against Taliban came from Afghan women, and
yeah.
that says volume, because despite the fear that they might have had, they have gone to the street and they demonstrated against Taliban. And Taliban themselves, they have accepted in one of their social media accounts that they are not afraid of the resistance as much as they are afraid of Afghan women.
Mm.
So I think for Taliban, it would not be that easy to rule the same way as they did in 1996.
Ms. Daud, thank you so much for your time and your insights. We look forward to hearing from you sometime in the future also. Okay. Thank you
Thank
so
you so
much.
much.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.